I'm going to have you watch a documentary from that Soviet Storm series. Again, don't the details of this. I'm not going to ruin your life by making all the details of all the Russian armies and the Soviet armies, but I just want you to get a sense of the whole and the significance of migration. I'll throw some facts and figures out at you in this podcast. 12 days after the beginning of migration, one of the smaller armies in Army Group Center, the Fourth Army, around the Soviet city of Minsk, it at the beginning of Bagration, it had 165,000 men. Within 12 days after the operation began, 130,000 of these 165,000 German soldiers in the Fourth Army were killed, wounded, or captured. That is what you call decimation of the army. And so what you had is that the Soviets, especially in the center area of Bagration, achieve enormous successes very, very quickly. The Soviets, they are able to move about 250 miles into German territory. German-held territory. It was the Soviet Union, but it was territory held by the Germans. And ultimately, what slows down the Soviet advance is they outrun their supplies. The bridges are burned or destroyed by the Germans. So the Soviets, and the same thing is happening in France as well. After the Saint-Lô breakout, Allied armies in France are moving towards Germany. But what happens to armies? You can't really outrun if you outrun your supplies, you can't move. And of course, when I'm talking about supplies here, I'm talking about gas. And that's what happened to the American and the British armies in France. The same thing happened in the Soviet Union, but also the Germans, as they're retreating, are destroying bridges and other areas of transportation arteries. So the Soviets score these huge successes, and move very, very deep into German lines. But ultimately, migration slows down, but it's an enormous success. Now, one of the things that you might want to think about, or you should think about in migration, what its success does, it sets up the Soviet Army, its ability to move into Eastern European countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Poland, and take over these countries. The Soviet army moves into these countries, liberates them from Germany. And I say that in quote because the Soviet rule was Soviets didn't have concentration camps. But of course, what happens is the Soviets take control over Eastern Europe until 1990, so for almost 50 years. So not only does migration have significant consequences in the defeat of Germany, although Germany's not defeated yet, but the German army suffers its worst defeat of the war at Operation Bagration. But what Bagration also does is it sets up Soviet control over Eastern Europe for 50 years, which is something that Churchill had really worried about, much more than Roosevelt worried about it. It's one of the reasons that Churchill pushed for the so-called soft underbelly. But really, how could it have been another way? The Churchill soft underbelly scheme was ridiculous. We would have never defeated the Germans by peripheral movements. The terrain, the Germans could have defended the terrain for years, that high terrain. So Churchill saw what was coming, and I guess give him credit for that. But what could you do? What could we do? it was just the way things worked out. And I don't think there's anything the Americans or the British could have done to stop the Soviets from moving into Eastern Europe. And ultimately, Churchill's proved wrong because Eastern Europe no longer is under Soviet rule, and it hasn't been for 30 years. So it did have to suffer from 1945 until 1990. But since then, from 1990 until today, of course, we're having fighting in Ukraine today, although it's not going great for Russia. Those areas of Eastern Europe have regained their independence, and they're not under Soviet domination. So what you had, there's another detail about Bagration. Stalin goes old school, and he captures 50,000 German soldiers, as well as killing and wounding many others. And he marches these German soldiers, these 57,000 German soldiers, most of them, 95% of them would be killed and it would never make it back to Germany. He marches them through Moscow. Very, very old school. It's almost like something a Roman emperor would have done. And, this is just Stalin at his most ruthless. And the reason he did that is that Allied newspapers were saying, "Oh, Bagration," to the extent that they were paying for it or paying attention to it. Papers in the U.S. They were saying, "Of course, the Soviets have had these huge advances on the Eastern Front. It's because of the landings at Normandy." And so what Stalin wanted to do by marching these 57,000 captured German troops through Moscow on their way to POW camps, enslaved labor and usually death, he wanted to show to the West, no, we faced a significant army and we defeated it, German army. And the Normandy invasions had very, very little to do with our success at Bagration. Had something to do, but very little to do ultimately. And he's also, of course, wants to humiliate Hitler. And this is a bit of revenge on the part of Stalin that he would march these German soldiers through the heart of Moscow after this major defeat. So Bagration, an enormous Soviet victory, the worst loss of the German army in the entirety of World War II. Again, it's a coordinated assault that had been decided upon between the Allies at Tehran, and it sets up the Soviets, for better for worse, moving into Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany. And very significant both in the ultimate defeat of the Nazis, but also the creation of the Cold War map, at least for 50 years. And paired with Normandy and the Allied invasions of France, June of 1944 was a very, very bad month for Hitler. By the way, the next month, some German officers tried to assassinate Hitler and came very close to killing him. He was very lucky he wasn't blown up. The bomb was in a suitcase, and the suitcase was moved to a part of a table that sheltered Hitler. So things would also go bad in July as well. So for the rest, whenever you think about World War II, and I doubt if you think about it that much, but I want you to pair Overlord. I want you to pair D-Day. I want you to pair Bagration with D-Day, and realize that the Germans faced this coordinated two-front assault. And the one in the East was actually even more devastating than the invasion, as significant as it was, and as much sacrifice as they took, than the one in Normandy.